The world remembers the voice first. The impossible sustained note, the kind that makes a stadium go quiet because everyone is suddenly afraid to breathe at the wrong time. But there's another sound that belongs to Céline Dion just as much, and it is one the cameras rarely capture. It is the sound of a woman whispering to a man in a hospital room, bargaining with time as if time could be convinced. On a January night in 2016, under harsh lights that make every face look older, she held René Angélil's hand and felt warmth slipping away in increments too small to name. She did not perform. She did not pose. She did not speak to the world. She simply said what people say when the person they built their life around is leaving and there is nothing left to trade. Do not go. For decades, the public version of their marriage was framed like a modern fairy tale. He discovered her young. He believed in her when nobody else could. He guided her to stardom. She loved him with a devotion so absolute it became part of her brand, part of the mythology that made her seem unbreakable. And for a long time, that mythology worked. It had a clean narrative line, the kind audiences prefer. A love so strong it defeats judgment, an age gap that becomes irrelevant, a partnership that survives the noise. But the truth people quietly circle around is not as tidy. A marriage can be legendary and still be complicated. A love story can be sincere and still carry shadows. A bond can feel like salvation to one person and like an imbalance to everyone watching from the outside. When you listen closely to Celine's own words over the years, and when you look at the timeline of what that relationship actually was, you begin to understand why the truth would never be one dramatic confession. It would be something more unsettling. It would be the admission that their love was not only romance. It was dependence built early, reinforced by the machinery of fame, and tested by pressures that most couples never have to face. Because their story did not begin with two equals meeting in the middle of adult life. It began when she was a child, and he was an experienced industry figure with the power to open doors and shape outcomes. The public has always held two competing reactions to that reality. One reaction is reverence, because the results were undeniable. He backed her, managed her, and helped build one of the most successful careers in modern music. The other reaction is discomfort, because the foundation of that bond raises questions no glossy wedding broadcast can erase. What does it mean when the person you love is also the person who made your dream possible? What happens when gratitude and security become intertwined with desire, and the line between the two can never be cleanly separated? The transcript you provided frames Celine as someone whose early life trained her to cling to stability when it finally appeared. That is not a scandalous idea. It is human psychology. A child raised with scarcity of space, attention, and safety will often attach intensely to the first figure who consistently provides it. In that kind of attachment, love is not only affection. Love is relief. Love is the end of fear. And when you have spent years feeling small, the person who makes you feel seen can quickly become your entire sky. So when rumors and allegations swirl around a powerful man, the headlines become less important than the private consequences. Tabloid culture has always fed on celebrity marriages, and claims about infidelity or impropriety, whether proven or not, can still poison a home because suspicion is corrosive even when it is unfounded. A couple can survive the courts and still bleed in the quiet after the cameras leave. This is why the most revealing moments in celebrity relationships are rarely the public statements. They are the silences, the cancellations, the sudden guardedness, the careful way a person answers a simple question without answering it at all. Then illness arrives and changes the entire moral landscape. Whatever the marriage was, whatever burdens it carried, cancer makes the world brutally small. The story stops being about public judgment and becomes about ordinary acts performed under extraordinary pressure. Feeding, waiting, listening, learning the rhythm of a loved one's pain, measuring days by breath and medication. The glamorous partnership the world admired collapses into something raw and private, and it forces the question that sits at the center of this story. When the person you depended on is dying, are you losing a spouse, Or are you losing the structure that held your identity together? And now, as Celine faces serious health challenges of her own, the timeline feels even more haunting. The woman who once sang as if her voice could outrun grief has had to confront a body that will not always cooperate with the will. In that context, admitting the truth does not have to mean exposing secrets for shock value. It can mean something quieter and more devastating. It can mean acknowledging that her marriage gave her everything and asked for everything in return, and that when Rene died, she did not simply grieve a husband. She grieved the anchor that had been there since childhood, the one constant presence behind every spotlight, the only person who knew the full story from before the world learned her name. To understand why Céline Dion's marriage to René Angélil became so absolute, so consuming, you have to step backward, past the wedding, past the scandals, even past the fame, and look at the emotional architecture that was already forming long before love entered the picture. Long before romance, there was need. Long before partnership, there was rescue. And relationships built on rescue rarely follow ordinary rules. The transcript paints Céline's childhood not as a sentimental rags-to-riches montage, but as a long apprenticeship in emotional self-containment. A crowded home, limited resources, and parents stretched thin by necessity created an environment where affection existed, but attention was fragmented. In such conditions, children often learn an unspoken lesson. Do not ask too much, do not take up space, do not expect the world to stop just because you're hurting. Over time, silence becomes a form of protection. Endurance becomes identity. Music, in this context, was not initially a dream. It was function. Celine sang because singing helped the family survive. She sang in adult spaces, learned early that applause could be transactional, that her voice could turn discomfort into approval and approval into money. That kind of upbringing wires a person to equate worth with performance. You are valuable when you deliver. You are safe when you please. Then came the audition, the moment that has been replayed and mythologized so many times it risks losing its psychological weight. Celine was 12, talented, timid, desperate to be seen. René Angélil was not a blank slate. He was older, experienced, carrying his own disappointments, and positioned to decide who deserved a chance. When she sang, the transcript describes him as stunned, not just by talent, but by something purer, something untouched by industry cynicism. And in that instant, the dynamic was set. René became the believer, the protector, the adult who said, "I see you." For a child who had learned not to expect that sentence, those words were transformative. He was not merely a manager who recognized potential. He became the axis around which her sense of safety rotated. When he took financial risks to support her early career, those actions did more than launch an artist. They created a debt that was emotional before it was ever financial. Gratitude, loyalty, and trust fused into something unbreakable. As the years passed, the bond deepened, but not evenly. Celine grew as an artist and a public figure. Yet internally, the transcript suggests her emotional development remained tethered to René's presence. His approval regulated her world. His disappointment felt catastrophic. This was not romantic love yet. It was attachment, profound, stabilizing, and frightening in its intensity. She sang to make him proud. She worked to justify his belief. Her success became proof that his sacrifice had meaning. By the time Celine reached adolescence, that attachment had quietly evolved into something more complex. She did not wake up one day and decide to fall in love. Love emerged gradually from proximity, reliance, and the absence of alternatives. René had been there for every milestone, every fear, every breakthrough. In her inner world, no one else existed with the same gravity. That is why the age gap, the optics, and the moral discomfort expressed by outsiders never fully penetrated her certainty. Her heart had already chosen long before her mind was equipped to debate it. When romance finally surfaced openly, it did so in secrecy. This secrecy was not only about avoiding scandal. It was about protecting the fragile ecosystem they had built. Public judgment threatened to reframe their story in ways Celine could not control, suggesting manipulation instead of devotion, obligation instead of choice. To preserve the purity of what she felt, she hid it. In doing so, the love grew more intense, more private, more insulated from reality. Secrecy can make affection feel sacred, but it also isolates it from correction. As Celine's career exploded globally, the imbalance within the relationship became harder to see from the outside. She was the star, the income, the voice that moved millions. Rene was the steady figure behind the scenes, often praised as the mastermind who guided her ascent. Yet emotionally, the hierarchy did not flip. Even as she became powerful in public, she remained dependent in private. The transcript repeatedly returns to this idea. Rene was not simply her partner. He was her compass. Without him, direction felt impossible. This is why rumors, allegations, and scandals, whether proven or not, hit with such force. For most couples, external accusations strain trust. For Celine, they threatened the foundation of her identity. If Rene was flawed, fallible, or unworthy, then the person she had built herself around was unstable. And if he fell, what did that mean for her? Defending him became more than loyalty. It became self-preservation. The gambling narratives introduced in the transcript, framed carefully as reported and alleged, reinforce this theme. Whether exaggerated or grounded in truth, they serve a symbolic purpose in the story. They represent risk, secrecy, and the quiet transfer of burden. Celine's performances, her Las Vegas residencies, her relentless schedule, these are depicted not only as triumphs, but as shields holding the family together under pressures the audience never saw. Applause masked anxiety. Success covered fear. Through it all, she stayed. Not because she was blind, but because leaving would have meant stepping into a world without the only constant she had ever known. Rene was not just her husband. He was the keeper of her past, the witness to her becoming. The man who knew her before the world told her who she was. Walking away from him would have felt like erasing herself. And so the marriage endured, not as a fairy tale, but as a complex system of love, gratitude, fear, and devotion. A system that functioned until illness arrived and stripped everything down to its core. When Rene became sick, power disappeared. Control vanished. What remained was the raw truth of their bond. A woman caring for the man who had once carried her dreams, now carrying his breath, his pain, his fading presence. In that final chapter, Celine was no longer the dependent child or the protected star. She became the pillar, the caregiver, the last voice he heard. And when he died, she did not just lose a husband. She lost the emotional architecture that had shaped her entire life. Only then did the full truth surface, not as scandal, but as reckoning. The realization that loving one person as your entire world can give you everything, and then take everything away at once. After René Angélil died, silence became the loudest presence in Céline Dion's life. Not the theatrical silence of a crowd waiting for a note, but the kind that settles into rooms and refuses to leave. The kind that makes a house feel too large, hallways too long, mornings unbearable. For more than 3 decades, René had occupied every invisible space in her world. His voice, his footsteps, his quiet authority had always been there, even when he said nothing. When he was gone, Celine did not simply lose companionship. She lost orientation. Grief, for her, was not dramatic. It was disorganizing. It arrived without spectacle and dismantled the habits that had once made life feel predictable. She had spent most of her adult existence moving forward under René's guidance, trusting his instincts when her own wavered. He had been the decision-maker, the shield against industry pressure, the one who filtered chaos so she could focus on singing. Without him, every choice felt heavier, every silence accusatory. There was no longer someone behind the curtain nodding reassurance before she stepped into the light. The public, of course, expected strength. They always do. Céline Dion was a symbol of resilience, of discipline, of emotional command. People spoke of her bravery as if grief were a performance she could master with rehearsal. But grief does not obey schedules, and it does not care about legacy. It arrives in waves, and sometimes it arrives as emptiness rather than tears. In interviews and rare public appearances after René's death, there was a noticeable restraint in her words. She spoke carefully, often circling pain rather than naming it. It was not avoidance. It was survival. Motherhood forced her forward when she might otherwise have stopped. Her sons became the reason she got out of bed, the reason she learned to mask devastation long enough to pack lunches, attend school meetings, answer questions no child should have to ask. When one of them wondered aloud where their father had gone, Celine did not have the luxury of collapsing. She had to translate death into language that would not break them. In doing so, she postponed her own reckoning. But postponement has a cost. The transcripts suggest that in the years following René's death, Celine's body began to carry what her voice could no longer release. Pain that had once been transformed into music had nowhere to go. Anxiety tightened muscles. Sleeplessness eroded strength. And slowly, insidiously, illness emerged, not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality that stripped away control. Stiff person syndrome did not announce itself gently. It arrived through spasms, rigidity, and an unpredictable betrayal of the body she had disciplined for decades. For someone whose entire identity was rooted in physical precision, breath control, posture, timing, this was not just illness. It was an existential threat. Singing had always been her refuge, the place where pain became something beautiful. Now, even that sanctuary was compromised. The cruelty of timing is impossible to ignore. Just as Celine was learning to live without the man who had anchored her, she was forced to confront the possibility of living without the voice that defined her. In public statements, she spoke with honesty that bordered on disbelief. She wanted to sing. She still felt music inside her, but her body no longer obeyed her will. Muscles locked. Tremors interrupted phrases. Notes that once flowed effortlessly now felt trapped behind invisible barriers. In moments of vulnerability, she admitted that fear would seize her when she tried to sing, as if an unseen hand were gripping her throat. This fear was not merely about performance. It was about identity. If she could not sing, who was she? René had always been the one to steady her when doubt crept in. Without him, she faced both grief and illness alone, navigating uncertainty without the compass she had trusted since childhood. This is where the meaning of admitting the truth quietly shifts. It is no longer about revealing secrets from the past. It is about acknowledging the emotional cost of a life built around one person and one purpose. Celine's truth is not scandalous. It is devastating in a quieter way. She loved René with everything she had, and in doing so, she tied her sense of safety, direction, and selfhood almost entirely to him. When he died, she did not just mourn. She unraveled. Yet unraveling does not always lead to disappearance. Sometimes it leads to redefinition. In the midst of pain and physical limitation, Celine began speaking not as a mythic figure, but as a woman learning how to exist again. She admitted fear. She admitted uncertainty. She admitted that strength was no longer effortless. These admissions mattered because they punctured the illusion that great love stories end neatly, or that devotion guarantees protection from loss. There's a subtle courage in choosing to remain visible while broken. Celine did not retreat entirely, nor did she rush back to reclaim the stage as if nothing had changed. Instead, she occupied a difficult middle ground, present but altered, honest but incomplete. She allowed the world to see that survival does not always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks tentative. Sometimes it looks like trembling hands gripping a table just to remain upright. In this phase of her life, the marriage to René is no longer framed as a fairy tale or a controversy. It becomes context. The reason her grief is so profound. The reason her illness feels so isolating. The reason rebuilding feels so daunting. Loving him shaped her. Losing him hollowed her. Facing life without him forced her to confront a version of herself she had never had to know. And still, there is music, not always sung, but remembered. Celine has spoken about how pain taught her how to sing with depth, how suffering carved pathways in her voice that joy alone never could. In that sense, René's presence and absence are both embedded in her art. He was there at the beginning, believing when no one else did. And he remains there now, not as a manager or protector, but as a memory that informs every breath she takes. Part 3 of his story is not about closure. It is about transition. It is about the moment after devotion loses its object and before identity finds new ground. Céline Dion stands in that space, between past and future, between strength and vulnerability, between silence and song. She does not yet know exactly who she will become without René Angélil at her side. What she knows is this. After René Angélil died, silence became the loudest presence in Céline Dion's life. Not the theatrical silence of a crowd waiting for a note, but the kind that settles into rooms and refuses to leave. The kind that makes a house feel too large, hallways too long, mornings unbearable. For more than 3 decades, René had occupied every invisible space in her world. His voice, his footsteps, his quiet authority had always been there, even when he said nothing. When he was gone, Celine did not simply lose companionship. She lost orientation. Grief, for her, was not dramatic. It was disorganizing. It arrived without spectacle and dismantled the habits that had once made life feel predictable. She had spent most of her adult existence moving forward under René's guidance, trusting his instincts when her own wavered. He had been the decision-maker, the shield against industry pressure, the one who filtered chaos so she could focus on singing. Without him, every choice felt heavier, every silence accusatory. There was no longer someone behind the curtain, nodding reassurance before she stepped into the light. The public, of course, expected strength. They always do. Céline Dion was a symbol of resilience, of discipline, of emotional command. People spoke of her bravery as if grief were a performance she could master with rehearsal. But grief does not obey schedules, and it does not care about legacy. It arrives in waves, and sometimes it arrives as emptiness rather than tears. In interviews and rare public appearances after René's death, there was a noticeable restraint in her words. She spoke carefully, often circling pain rather than naming it. It was not avoidance. It was survival. Motherhood forced her forward when she might otherwise have stopped. Her sons became the reason she got out of bed, the reason she learned to mask devastation long enough to pack lunches, attend school meetings, answer questions no child should have to ask. When one of them wondered aloud where their father had gone, Celine did not have a luxury of collapsing. She had to translate death into language that would not break them. In doing so, she postponed her own reckoning. But postponement has a cost. The transcripts suggest that in the years following René's death, Celine's body began to carry what her voice could no longer release. Pain that had once been transformed into music had nowhere to go. Anxiety tightened muscles. Sleeplessness eroded strength. And slowly, insidiously, illness emerged, not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality that stripped away control. Stiff person syndrome did not announce itself gently. It arrived through spasms, rigidity, and an unpredictable betrayal of the body she had disciplined for decades. For someone whose entire identity was rooted in physical precision, breath control, posture, timing, this was not just illness. It was an existential threat. Singing had always been her refuge, the place where pain became something beautiful. Now, even that sanctuary was compromised. The cruelty of timing is impossible to ignore. Just as Celine was learning to live without the man who had anchored her, she was forced to confront the possibility of living without the voice that defined her. In public statements, she spoke with honesty that bordered on disbelief. She wanted to sing. She still felt music inside her. but her body no longer obeyed her will. Muscles locked. Tremors interrupted phrases. Notes that once flowed effortlessly now felt trapped behind invisible barriers. In moments of vulnerability, she admitted that fear would seize her when she tried to sing, as if an unseen hand were gripping her throat. This fear was not merely about performance. It was about identity. If she could not sing, who was she? Rene had always been the one to steady her when doubt crept in. Without him, she faced both grief and illness alone, navigating uncertainty without the compass she had trusted since childhood. This is where the meaning of admitting the truth quietly shifts. It is no longer about revealing secrets from the past. It is about acknowledging the emotional cost of a life built around one person and one purpose. Celine's truth is not scandalous. It is devastating in a quieter way. She loved Rene with everything she had, and in doing so, she tied her sense of safety, direction, and selfhood almost entirely to him. When he died, she did not just mourn. She unraveled. Yet unraveling does not always lead to disappearance. Sometimes it leads to redefinition. In the midst of pain and physical limitation, Celine began speaking not as a mythic figure, but as a woman learning how to exist again. She admitted fear. She admitted uncertainty. She admitted that strength was no longer effortless. These admissions mattered because they punctured the illusion that great love stories end neatly, or that devotion guarantees protection from loss. There is a subtle courage in choosing to remain visible while broken. Celine did not retreat entirely, nor did she rush back to reclaim the stage as if nothing had changed. Instead, she occupied a difficult middle ground, present but altered, honest but incomplete. She allowed the world to see that survival does not always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks tentative. Sometimes it looks like trembling hands gripping a table just to remain upright. In this phase of her life, the marriage to Rene is no longer framed as a fairy tale or a controversy. It becomes context. The reason her grief is so profound. The reason her illness feels so isolating. The reason rebuilding feels so daunting. Loving him shaped her. Losing him hollowed her. Facing life without him forced her to confront a version of herself she had never had to know. And still, there is music, not always sung, but remembered. Celine has spoken about how pain taught her how to sing with depth, how suffering carved pathways in her voice that joy alone never could. In that sense, Rene's presence and absence are both embedded in her art. He was there at the beginning, believing when no one else did. And he remains there now, not as a manager or protector, but as a memory that informs every breath she takes. Part 3 of this story is not about closure. It is about transition. It is about the moment after devotion loses its object and before identity finds new ground. Céline Dion stands in that space, between past and future, between strength and vulnerability, between silence and song. She does not yet know exactly who she will become without René Angélil at her side. What she knows is this: love shaped her, loss stripped her, and survival demands a courage she is still learning how to claim. The period that followed René Angélil's death was not defined by dramatic turning points, but by slow, exhausting recalibration. Céline Dion did not wake up one morning with renewed clarity or sudden independence. Instead, she moved through days that felt improvised, learning how to exist without the quiet authority that had once shaped every decision. Grief did not recede in a straight line. It lingered, resurfacing in mundane moments. An empty chair at the table, a familiar silence backstage, the absence of a voice that used to say, "You're ready." For the first time since childhood, Celine was forced to make choices without a guiding presence she trusted absolutely. That alone was destabilizing. Rene had not simply been her husband. He had been the interpreter of the world. He filtered risk, negotiated pressure, and absorbed conflict so she could remain focused on her craft. Without him, the machinery of fame felt exposed and louder. Every offer, every plan, Every step forward required a confidence she had never needed to cultivate independently. The transcript suggests that this loss of direction was as painful as the loss of love itself. Celine had spent decades being strong in a very specific way, strong within a structure. Now the structure was gone, and strength had to be rebuilt from something internal rather than relational. That process was neither glamorous nor inspirational in the conventional sense. It involved hesitation, second-guessing, and an unfamiliar intimacy with fear. Motherhood continued to anchor her during this phase, but even that role shifted. With Rene gone, Celine carried the full weight of emotional stability for her sons. She became the sole narrator of their family story, the one who translated absence into reassurance. In doing so, she often suppressed her own need to fall apart. Grief was postponed again and again, packed away to make room for bedtime routines, school schedules, and the constant responsibility of being the strong one. At the same time, the public gaze never fully turned away. Fans, media, and industry observers watched closely, waiting for signs of collapse or comeback. Silence was interpreted as retreat. Vulnerability was analyzed for meaning. Celine was expected to either embody resilience perfectly or disappear quietly. Neither option reflected the reality she was living. She was not broken beyond repair, but she was not whole either. She existed in a liminal space the public rarely allows its icons to occupy. Illness complicated everything further. The progression of her physical condition introduced an unpredictable element into daily life, eroding confidence in her own body. For someone whose career had depended on mastery of breath, posture, stamina, this loss of reliability was deeply unsettling. Her body, once disciplined and obedient, became a source of uncertainty. Pain arrived without warning. Control slipped at the moments she needed it most. The psychological toll of this shift cannot be overstated. Celine had already lost the person who anchored her emotionally. Now she faced the possibility of losing the one tool that had always helped her survive pain, her voice. Singing had never been just a profession. It was the language through which she processed suffering, gratitude, love, and fear. When that language faltered, silence returned. Not the silence of grief alone, but the silence of identity, suspended. Yet even here, the story does not descend into despair. What emerges instead is a quieter transformation. Celine began speaking more openly, not about triumph, but about limitation. She acknowledged fear rather than masking it. She admitted uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. These admissions marked a subtle shift in power. For the first time, she was defining herself publicly without René's framework, without the expectation of perfection. This phase reveals a different kind of courage, one that does not rely on control or certainty. Celine learned to accept help, something she had rarely needed to do in the same way before. She allowed vulnerability to exist without immediately turning it into inspiration. In doing so, she challenged the narrative that strength must always be loud or victorious. Sometimes strength is simply remaining present when retreat would be easier. Memory played a complicated role in this rebuilding. René's presence lingered everywhere, not as a guiding voice, but as an emotional echo. Decisions were still measured against what he might have said, what he might have advised. Over time, this internal dialogue shifted. His memory became less directive and more reflective, less about instruction and more about connection. He was no longer steering her life, but he remained part of how she understood herself. This internalization marked a turning point. Celine did not replace Rene. She did not move on in the simplistic sense often demanded by outsiders. Instead, she learned to carry him differently. The bond that once defined her externally became something she held internally, no longer a dependency, but a memory that informed her values, her caution, and her compassion. Public perception struggled to keep up with this nuance. Some interpreted her reduced visibility as weakness. Others framed her honesty as bravery. Neither label fully captured the reality. Celine was not performing resilience. She was negotiating existence under altered conditions. The marriage that once defined her public narrative now functioned as a private reference point, a source of meaning rather than a headline. In this stage of the story, the truth, Celine admits, is not about scandal, control, or regret. It is about consequence. Loving one person so completely shaped her life in extraordinary ways. It gave her purpose, direction, and security. It also left her profoundly vulnerable when that person was gone. Both realities can coexist without canceling each other out. As Céline Dion moved through the years after René Angélil's death, her life became a careful balance between preservation and reinvention. The spotlight that had once highlighted her achievements now revealed the absence of the man who had quietly orchestrated so much behind the scenes. The public still saw success, residencies, albums, awards, but the private world that had given her stability was gone. Every decision, from scheduling performances to managing family life, now carried the weight of independence that she had rarely exercised before. René had been her compass, and without him, the terrain was unfamiliar and often frightening. Motherhood intensified the demands of this new reality. Her sons, once partially protected from grief by her presence as a stabilizing partner, became the axis around which her decisions revolved. She could not mourn openly, not fully, without risking the emotional equilibrium of the children who looked to her for guidance and reassurance. In quiet moments, when the house was empty or the stage dark, the depth of her own loss would press in. But in front of her children, she remained a source of warmth and stability. She translated absence into comfort, explaining a father's passing in a way that was gentle yet truthful. Her own grief became a carefully contained space, segmented into private hours, while the rest of the world observed only the polished exterior of a global star. Her health challenges compounded the complexity of this period. Stiff person syndrome introduced uncertainty into every action that had once been second nature. Muscle spasms, tremors, and pain challenged her physical autonomy, while the voice that had always expressed emotion was no longer fully reliable. Singing, the activity that had defined her identity and shaped her emotional resilience, became both a refuge and a source of fear. The very instrument that had carried her through decades of personal and professional turbulence now demanded negotiation and patience, teaching her that mastery over her body and voice was never guaranteed. In interviews, Celine began to articulate a kind of honesty rarely granted to public figures of her stature. She spoke of vulnerability, of fear, of the constant negotiation between ambition, health, and grief. These statements were not intended to elicit sympathy. They were admissions of lived reality. Strength, she began to convey, was not an absence of fear, but the courage to persist despite it. Her narrative challenged the simplistic dichotomy of triumph versus collapse, showing audiences that resilience often manifests as quiet persistence in ordinary moments rather than grand gestures. The ongoing management of her public image also presented a subtle tension. Fans, media, and industry professionals continued to watch, often expecting clear signs of revival or complete recovery. Silence was misinterpreted as withdrawal. Visible effort was sometimes read as performative resilience. Celine's adaptation to life without René involved both public engagement and private retreat, each chosen with deliberation. She had to navigate a world that simultaneously demanded the return of the icon while respecting the private mourning that shaped her daily existence. Memory remained a critical, though complicated, guide. René's influence did not vanish with his death. Instead, it was internalized. Decisions, instincts, and even emotional responses were informed by his presence in her memory. The internalized relationship acted as a subtle framework, helping her navigate uncertainties while preserving the lessons of love, loyalty, and discipline that had guided her career. At the same time, She had to reconcile these memories with the reality of autonomy, the realization that she must now interpret the world and act independently, without the scaffolding that had supported her for decades. Celine's public narrative, carefully shaped over years of stardom, also had to accommodate the evolving truth of her personal experience. The transcript emphasizes that admitting the truth was never about scandal or exposing private failings. It was about acknowledging the profound complexity of love and loss. Her marriage was not a perfect romance. It was a long-term partnership that blended devotion, dependence, sacrifice, and resilience. To articulate this to the public required subtlety. She needed to honor the depth of their bond without compromising personal dignity or the privacy of her family. As part of the ongoing adaptation, Celine also grappled with the duality of audience expectation and personal need. She had spent a lifetime delivering performances that were technically perfect, emotionally moving, and commercially successful. Now, each performance carried an additional layer: the necessity of sustaining her livelihood, the expectation to maintain her legacy, and the internal challenge of performing while managing physical limitations and emotional vulnerability. Every note sung became both an act of survival and a testament to the endurance of her art, linking past triumphs with present realities. In parallel, Celine faced the psychological complexity of grief in long-term partnerships. Losing someone who had been central to her identity meant more than emotional sadness. It demanded the reconstruction of selfhood. Decisions that had once been guided by René's counsel now required independent judgment, a skill she had relied upon sparingly. Everyday routines, meal planning, schedules, family logistics, career negotiations, became arenas of practice for autonomy. These tasks, seemingly mundane, were essential exercises in rebuilding confidence and competence in a life restructured by absence. Through this process, the concept of resilience shifted from a performative ideal to a deeply internal practice. Celine demonstrated that endurance is not merely the absence of failure or the attainment of perfection, but the ongoing ability to adapt, to navigate limitations, and to maintain connections that provide purpose and meaning. Her continued engagement with music, philanthropy, and family life illustrates a reorientation of priorities, sustaining legacy while cultivating personal agency. In conclusion, this phase of Celine Dion's story is defined less by public achievements than by private reconstruction. The narrative emphasizes that loss does not yield to timelines, nor does identity immediately recalibrate in the absence of foundational relationships. Celine's adaptation reflects a nuanced understanding of human resilience, the capacity to integrate grief, dependence, and personal growth into a coherent, though evolving, life experience. Her journey underscores that enduring love can coexist with profound vulnerability, and that the courage to continue is often quiet, gradual, and deeply personal. As Celine Dion navigated life beyond René Angélil, her days became a delicate negotiation between legacy, personal responsibility, and the weight of memory. The world continued to see her as a force of nature, an artist whose voice could command arenas, who had transcended the ordinary limitations of fame. But behind the scenes, Celine faced the immense challenge of redefining herself without the presence of the man who had long served as both guide and anchor. Each decision, whether related to her career, her household, or her family, now required her independent judgment, and the absence of René's stabilizing influence was profoundly felt. The role of motherhood emerged as both a lifeline and an additional burden. Celine's children became the axis around which her new life revolved. She assumed the full weight of emotional stability for them, translating the absence of their father into reassurance, structure, and guidance. In this role, she often suppressed her own grief, prioritizing the immediate needs of her family over personal processing of loss. Moments of solitude revealed the depth of her pain. Empty rooms, quiet corridors, the lingering echo of René's voice, but in front of her children, she remained a source of calm and strength. This balance required extraordinary emotional discipline, one that few could fully appreciate from the outside. Her physical health introduced a new set of obstacles. Stiff person syndrome, a rare and debilitating condition, compromised the very instrument upon which her life and identity had been built, her body and her voice. Spasms, rigidity, and tremors rendered movements unpredictable, while her voice, the medium through which she had processed and expressed emotion for decades, was no longer reliably obedient. Singing, once a source of solace and power, became fraught with uncertainty. Celine had to negotiate every note, every breath, and every stage presence, recalibrating her relationship with her craft and confronting the fragility of her physical autonomy. The psychological impact of this physical limitation was profound. Celine had always relied on discipline, control, and routine. Her identity was intertwined with mastery, breath control, precise gestures, and flawless performances. When the body betrayed her, she faced not only practical challenges but existential ones. Who was she if the voice that had defined her could falter? Who was she if physical vulnerability constrained expression? This internal questioning demanded courage, patience, and a willingness to redefine her own metrics of success. Memory and the enduring influence of René Angélil became both anchor and guide. Though he was no longer physically present, his legacy shaped Celine's internal compass. Decisions were often measured against what he might have advised. His presence felt in the form of internalized counsel and enduring principles. Yet, the challenge lay in reconciling dependence with autonomy, learning to act independently while honoring the lessons and love that had defined her formative years. This process highlighted the intricate interplay between attachment, identity, and adaptation, demonstrating that the bonds formed over decades do not simply vanish with absence. They evolve, internalized and reframed to guide ongoing choices. Public expectation added another layer of complexity. Fans and the media continued to scrutinize every action, interpreting silence as withdrawal or effort as performance. Celine had to navigate the tension between authentic self-expression and public interpretation, balancing the need for privacy with the inevitability of public attention. She had to determine which battles to fight, which moments to share, and how to maintain dignity and emotional honesty in a world that frequently demanded spectacle. The transcript emphasizes her careful calibration, honest about struggle, selective about disclosure, revealing a nuanced understanding of how private grief and public persona intersect. Through all of this, her career remained a stabilizing force. Music, though physically more demanding and emotionally complex, continued to provide structure and purpose. Each rehearsal, each recording session, each performance became a negotiation between endurance and expression, a means of asserting agency in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. The stage offered continuity, a space where her identity and skill could persist, even as her private life underwent profound transformation. Music remained not only a profession, but a medium for processing grief, conveying emotion, and asserting presence despite the fractures in her personal world. Celine's ongoing adaptation also illuminates the broader psychological consequences of long-term attachment and loss. The transcript frames her relationship with Rene as not merely marital, but developmental. He was the one who had witnessed her growth from childhood into global stardom, the anchor of her emotional and professional life. The sudden absence of such a figure destabilized previously implicit assumptions about security, guidance, and self-efficacy. Reconstructing autonomy required both introspection and the gradual reallocation of responsibilities previously shared or assumed by Rene. This phase also underscored the resilience inherent in sustained devotion. Celine's ability to continue performing, to maintain family stability, and to adapt to physical and emotional challenges reflects a form of courage that is often invisible. Resilience in this context is not the absence of suffering, but the capacity to continue living meaningfully in the presence of ongoing adversity. It manifests as the small, daily acts of persistence, holding a child, practicing a note, completing an errand, or navigating a medical appointment, each of which carries the weight of survival and self-preservation. As the years progressed, Céline Dion's life became a careful interplay of persistence, adaptation, and reflection. She continued to carry the weight of René Angélil's absence, yet she was compelled to forge forward, for her children, for her legacy, and for the music that remained both her livelihood and her emotional language. Each day was a negotiation between memory and independence, between vulnerability and performance, between grief and the practicalities of sustaining a household, a career, and her own health. The transcript highlights that, in the absence of René, Celine had to redefine what it meant to be strong. Strength was no longer about achieving perfection on stage or adhering to rigid routines. It became about endurance, the willingness to rise each morning, to perform despite trembling hands or spasms, to navigate emotional fragility without allowing it to dismantle her obligations. In this new paradigm, courage was quiet and incremental. It manifested in the subtle choices, holding a child close while the ache in her chest throbbed, stepping onto a stage when her body signaled fatigue, or speaking honestly in interviews about the ongoing challenges she faced. Her health challenges remained a central concern. Stiff person syndrome, with its unpredictable muscle spasms and limitations, required her to adjust routines, pacing, and expectations constantly. Vocal exercises, therapy sessions, and rehearsals became exercises in both physical control and emotional discipline. Every performance was no longer simply a professional achievement. It was a negotiation with her body and mind, an assertion of identity in a context where the tools that had once guaranteed expression now demanded patience, creativity, and resilience. Motherhood continued to be both anchor and challenge. Celine assumed full responsibility for the emotional and logistical needs of her children, translating the absence of their father into presence and guidance. The transcript emphasizes how her role shifted from being supported to providing support, from sharing responsibility to assuming it entirely. She became the stabilizing figure, the one who maintained continuity in a life previously guided by René's counsel. Her grief, though deeply personal, was subordinated to the immediate needs of family, demonstrating the intersection of love, sacrifice, and endurance. Public perception remained a persistent factor. Fans, media, and industry observers continued to watch her closely, interpreting her actions as either evidence of continued resilience or signs of fragility. Celine had to navigate this scrutiny carefully. Transparency was necessary to preserve credibility, yet too much exposure risked invasion into deeply personal spaces. This tension underscores the unique challenges faced by public figures whose personal histories are inseparable from their professional identities. Celine's choices demonstrate the subtlety required to maintain agency while satisfying the expectations of a global audience. Memory of René Angélil played a complex role in shaping her continued adaptation. His influence was internalized rather than immediate, guiding her decisions without dictating them. This internalization allowed her to draw upon lessons of loyalty, discipline, and emotional acuity while cultivating independence. The transcript frames this as a subtle but powerful presence, a source of reference that helped her navigate uncertainty, manage family obligations, and make career decisions in a manner consistent with the principles they had shared over decades. The emotional evolution of Celine's relationship with her past is central to understanding her resilience. Love, dependence, and devotion were not erased by absence. They were transformed. The transcript emphasizes that her bond with René, though no longer active, continued to inform her emotional landscape. It shaped her expectations, her priorities, and her strategies for navigating the intersection of personal and professional responsibilities. In this sense, her ongoing adaptation is a dialogue with history, a conscious integration of past experience into present action. Music remained both a lifeline and a medium of identity. Each performance, rehearsal, and recording session was a reminder of the skills she had honed under René's guidance and a demonstration of her ability to assert control in a world that had become unpredictable. Singing, once an externalized expression of emotion, became a form of negotiation with her own limitations. The transcript underscores that her art served as a conduit for processing grief, asserting independence, and maintaining a sense of continuity despite disruption. Celine's story, as framed in the transcript, reveals a nuanced understanding of resilience. It is neither immediate nor performative. It does not manifest in dramatic gestures alone. Instead, it appears in daily acts of persistence, in the careful management of emotion and responsibility, and in the cultivation of selfhood amid loss. Her journey demonstrates that endurance is both practical and psychological, requiring navigation of internal and external pressure simultaneously. In the closing phase of this story, the transcript emphasizes reconciliation, not resolution. Celine does not replace René, nor does she erase the dependence that once shaped her identity. Instead, she reconfigures it, transforming memory and experience into guidance, strength, and perspective. She continues to navigate the demands of public life, familial responsibility, and personal health, while maintaining the integrity of her emotional history.